IPCC's success is exactly in their decision making, because first of all, it's a co-generation process, co-decision making process. So both the governance and also the whole operation is set up so that policy making and science works integrally together. And that's a model why I think, even though there are, of course, many shortcomings in the whole IPCC process, but I think that's exactly the process that makes the IPCC so successful, that it's still considered to be kind of the Bible of, or our products are considered as the Bible of the climate negotiation. So I think what, although it's not perhaps not that easy to replicate for other organizations, nevertheless, I think in general, for science policy interface, I think this is a really, this co-design and although co-leadership and co-governance is a really important aspect of the structure. So for example, we have in our governing body both scientists and the government representatives. And I think that model could, I don't know how well it can be transferred, but I think it's a really important model to be considered everywhere. For every organization, institution who cares for influencing policy, for every scientific influence, every scientific organization who cares to influence policy, because very often the science policy interface, we think as scientists, it's kind of, we want to operationalize it kind of one directional. We have our fantastic scientific findings and we want to communicate that with the policymakers. And that just doesn't really work very well. So I think if one tries to involve the policymaker already at the beginning, but of course they are very busy. So if it's a one-off something, it's more difficult. But if they are structurally integrated and they are already asked at the start of the setup of the organization, or at least its governance structures, and they are organizationally somehow integrated and evolved, I think it's much easier to already design even the products, the processes, how you arrive at the products, for these to be much better integrated. Of course, maybe what needs to be added, that I think there needs to be different models. There is not one model that works for everything, because of course there are downsides to this model as well, because you do have to, well, I wouldn't say compromise the science, that's not true, but it still affects, it still influences the final outcomes, which is fine. But I think this is why it's important to have a plurality of approaches and different structures. And I think each structure has their own benefits. And that's why it's really good to have different structures. And that's why it's really excellent that you're doing this work, because we understand the benefits and perhaps the drawbacks or limitations of the different structures and different government approaches. So first of all, of course, it's extremely important to communicate. On the other hand, I think it's also important to understand the more and more recently more and more established science that humans cannot fully change their behaviors, or we try, but it's like going on a diet. We always try, but then most of the time we fail, and then we go back to our old diets. Humans just cannot. And even, like smoking, everybody knows that smoking is lethal. Still, a lot of people do it. So I think that needs to be understood against the plurality of different people. So I think it's important that the information is out there, and that people, but it's more important that people have access to more sustainable choices. So the systemic transformation is more important, that people are able easier to make these decisions, and these decisions are not sacrifices. So for example, what we call in science sometimes nudges. Now, let me just bring a couple of examples, since you asked about energy efficiency. For example, in buildings, let's say if the room temperature is set by default in the air conditioning season, let's say to 26 degrees, you could still, if you really wanted to have cooler, you could have to just go to a panel and always, reset for an hour. You can reset the temperature to, let's say, 22 if you want, but after an hour you would have to do it again. So things like this, very small things, which would still influence a lot our behavior. So defaults and nudges, or for example, if cafeterias always would offer the menu A, would always be the vegetable, the plant-based meal, and then you can have meat, but it's the menu C, let's say, or something like that. So it's really important that that I think with information is not enough. Information is very important, but it has to come together with incentives, nudges, perhaps cost incentives, because without that, the science shows that it has very limited impact, just knowledge. Knowledge rarely translates into real action. Of course, it's different for children and young who are still adopting who are still establishing their lifestyle, who are still establishing their culture, their habits. And for that, it's a different thing. So I think that's why communicating to the youth is pivotal. But the problem is, and that the challenge is, I believe that most of our current communication is not so appropriate for the youth, because now there is a huge disconnect. There is a huge divide between generations, especially in communications. They use very different communication channels. They use very different type of communication. And as we communicate, I think our communication just doesn't really reach them. So if we can somehow communicate more on their platforms, in their language, in their style, it would be much more effective. So I think these are some of the challenges, but it's true that it's crucial, but it cannot alone, it's not sufficient. To some extent, we must enter that race as well, which is, we can argue with that if it's good race or not, but that's their reality, and we don't enter that to some extent, then we are just not going to reach them. But I think the biggest area by far is buildings and mobility. And but in these two aspects, or especially mobility, we need to capture efficiency at a higher level, or conceptualize energy efficiency at the higher level. But for buildings, that's really the success story, because today we can, everywhere in the world, we can build and retrofit buildings which can supply better levels of services than today for net zero levels of energy. So virtually everywhere, there are a few exceptions, but it's just hot and humid climate and commercial high-rise buildings and hot and humid climate. So which there are quite a few of those, but still the vast majority of the world, we can do it. And we have also shown many times, and by the commercial also, that it's also cost effective. So that means I was very impressed that the chair of IPCC, without any of my influence, it was absolutely his choice, in his 5-minute speech that he could say at releasing the synthesis report of over 10,000 pages. This was the one example he mentioned, that in buildings we can reduce energy emissions by 66% by demand. So I think that the buildings is definitely a crucial area. Of course, there are many barriers, but that's, I think, why we need, but these barriers are possible to transcend. So I think this is why this is a really key area which we need to talk much more about, finally, to get over these barriers and make scale a level change in that area. In mobility, it's also very important, but there it's not only efficiency of the vehicles, so we need to transcend that, but energy efficiency of our whole mobility system. And there we'll need to think about efficient design of cities, efficient land use planning, efficient use of information technologies and data and artificial intelligence to predict mobility demands, and that's how better transgressing to 21st century public transport models, which are demand-based and AI empowered, and basically shared vehicles running based on demand rather than by fixed routes and fixed timetables, which is a model from the 20th century. So energy efficiency here is a bit broader concept, but I think these two areas have tremendous promise, and not only tremendous promise cost-wise, but also tremendous promise in terms of improving our qualities, life qualities of life and well-being. Right, I think the most important thing, and that's why IIASA is so uniquely positioned in that, is their access to an international dialogue and also multilateral dialogue, because such dialogues are very rare. They've happened within IPCC, they were within the UN walls and so on, but these are very rare and very isolated and very and they have their own functions. So I think IIASA, as one of the very few internationally positioned or whose international mandated organizations, they're in very good positions, and also they are not only international but also really are very well positioned between science and policy. So I think and also have a tremendous reach to highest level, both scientists as well as change makers, and deliberately I use a word in a broader context than just decision makers, but change makers. And I think the dialogue among them is exactly that co-design process, and that knowledge co-design is which can catalyze change much better than if we simply work in the silo of scientists. And that's why I have been really appreciating this process, that this has been involving many stakeholders and managed to engage and leverage these diverse stakeholders.